The water was already disturbed before she touched it. It carried a faint vibration, barely visible on the surface, as if something beneath had shifted its weight and then gone still. Evelyn noticed it in the half-second before her foot entered the pool, a subtle wrongness that tightened her throat. She froze, listening, aware that the house above her breathed in a rhythm that did not belong to sleep. Pipes ticked, wood contracted. Somewhere far away, a clock marked time that felt borrowed. She told herself it was exhaustion. That fear sharpened patterns until they felt intentional, that nothing in a basement bath could watch her. She was wrong, and the first 30 seconds of her stay in the house had already been spent lying to herself. New Orleans pressed down on the night like a damp hand. Heat clung to skin even after midnight, and the air smelled of rain that had already passed and flowers that were rotting slowly in ornamental planters. The city did not sleep so much as drift, half aware, its pulse uneven, its breath heavy with alcohol, river water, and history that refused to stay buried. Evelyn had arrived 2 days earlier with one suitcase and a borrowed identity, stepping off the bus into a street that glistened as if it had been freshly washed for her arrival. She had not come for romance, and she had not come for the city. She had come because her sister had vanished, and New Orleans was the kind of place where people disappeared quietly. Here, missing persons reports were paperwork, not emergencies. Names blurred into columns, dates lost urgency, and grief became administrative. The police had been polite, efficient, and detached in the way only cities with long memories of violence could be. They had promised calls that never came. So Evelyn had made her own way in. The opportunity arrived wrapped in charity. A private foundation with deep roots and immaculate branding needed short-term domestic help at one of its donor residences. No questions. Background checks waved through third parties. A job designed for people who passed through unnoticed and left nothing behind. Someone she barely trusted had passed her name along. Someone who knew how the city worked at night. The house stood at the edge of the garden district, where old money softened its edges with trees and iron fences. It did not announce itself. No lights blazed. No cameras were visible from the street. It sat back from the road like a patient animal, broad-shouldered, silent, its windows dark and reflective. The iron gate opened without sound when her temporary pass was scanned, and it closed behind her with a finality that made her spine tighten. Inside, the air changed. The house smelled clean, but not freshly cleaned. There was no sharpness, no chemical trace. Instead, there was something mineral beneath the polish, something old. Marble floors held a faint chill that rose through the soles of her shoes. The walls were paneled in dark wood that had been restored carefully enough to hide its age, but not enough to erase it. Light fell in controlled pools, never too bright, never quite shadowless. Evelyn understood immediately what kind of place it was. Not a home meant to be lived in, but a space meant to be maintained. A vessel. Her role was simple: temporary assistant, errand runner, quiet presence. She was to observe nothing, ask nothing, and leave no trace of herself behind. The woman who oriented her spoke in soft, measured tones and never stood with her back to a mirror. Evelyn noticed that before she noticed anything else. She noticed a lot. She noticed the way doorframes were carved with patterns that repeated too precisely to be decorative. She noticed thin lines of white powder worked into the seams of the marble near thresholds, swept carefully enough to look accidental. She noticed mirrors hung slightly angled, never flat against the wall, and how her reflection sometimes lagged a fraction of a second behind her movements when she passed too quickly. She noticed because she had always noticed. As a child, she had been the one who remembered which stair creaked, which window stuck, which rooms felt colder than they should. Her sister used to tease her for it, said Evelyn lived like the world, was always about to confess something if she watched closely enough. Now the world had taken her sister, and Evelyn was done waiting for confessions. The man who owned the house did not appear the first day. She learned his name before she saw him because the staff spoke it with care. Cal Harrow, donor, strategist, philanthropist, a man whose money flowed into hospitals, schools, and redevelopment projects with equal discretion, publicly admired, privately untouchable. When Evelyn finally saw him, it was from the upper landing as he descended the main staircase. He wore a dark suit that fit too perfectly to be fashionable. His movements were economical, unhurried, as if gravity itself had adjusted to accommodate him. He did not look up at first, but the moment his foot touched the marble at the base of the stairs, something in the space shifted. Evelyn felt it before she understood it. A pressure change, subtle but immediate, like stepping into deeper water than expected. Her skin prickled. The small hairs along her arms lifted. Cal Harrow raised his head, and his gaze swept the landing without settling on her, and still she knew she had been seen. What unsettled her was not his appearance. He was striking in an unremarkable way, the kind of man who could disappear into any crowd if he chose. What unsettled her was the sensation that the air around him was remembering something, as if the room itself recognized him more deeply than any person did. For a brief, disorienting moment, his shadow on the wall behind him bent the wrong way. Then he moved, and it aligned again. That night, sleep did not come easily. The guest room assigned to her was comfortable in a way that felt curated rather than generous. The bed was heavy. The sheets smelled faintly of ozone and something botanical she could not place. When she turned off the lamp, the darkness settled immediately, thick and complete, without the ambient glow of streetlights or passing cars. She lay awake, listening to the house breathe. At some point after midnight, she dressed quietly and left her room. She did not know exactly why. Restlessness, she told herself. A need to wash the day off her skin. A desire to be somewhere that did not feel like it was watching her back. The service corridors were narrower, less ornate. They carried the marks of utility rather than display. The further down she went, the older the house felt. Stone replaced wood. The air grew cooler, heavier. She followed a faint sound of moving water until she reached the basement wing. The pool was not large. It was circular, lined with dark stone, and fed by a constant trickle that kept the water moving just enough to prevent stagnation. Someone had built it long before modern plumbing standards, and someone else had maintained it with obsessive care. The water was clear, but so dark it swallowed the light after a few inches, reflecting only vague shapes and the low ceiling above. Evelyn undressed slowly, alert now, every sense extended. She listened for footsteps, for voices, for anything that did not belong to the steady drip of water against stone. When she stepped in, the chill shocked her lungs, stealing her breath. She sank until the water covered her shoulders, then lower, until the noise of the house dulled to a distant murmur. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to close her eyes. She did not see him enter. She felt him. The sensation was not sight or sound, but presence, sudden and absolute, like a pressure change deep underwater. Her eyes snapped open as she turned toward the door. He stood just inside the threshold, his silhouette defined by the dim light behind him. For a fraction of a second, he did not look human at all. The shape of him was wrong, elongated in ways that defied perspective, his outline blurring as if the space around him could not quite agree on where he ended. Then he forced himself into focus. Evelyn remained still, the water lapping quietly against stone. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her body did not move. Instinct told her that sudden motion would be a mistake. She met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw calculation, restraint, and something older that did not bother pretending to be kind. He watched her with the intensity of someone reassessing a long-set plan. Not desire, not surprise, recognition without memory. After a moment that stretched beyond comfort, he turned and left. The door closed without a sound, and the space exhaled. Evelyn stayed in the water long after her skin began to numb. She understood two things with perfect clarity. She had crossed a boundary she did not yet comprehend, and whatever lived in this house had just acknowledged her existence. Above her, New Orleans continued to breathe, unaware or uncaring. The city had taken her sister. The house had taken note of her. And the water, now perfectly still, reflected nothing at all. Cal Harrow entered the space without sound, the way something did that had never learned to ask permission from walls or air. He did not open the door so much as appear on the other side of it, as if distance briefly forgot to exist for him. He should not have been there. He knew at the moment his awareness locked onto the shape in the water, and the house knew it too, tightening around the moment like a held breath. She should not have been there either. The violation was mutual, and because of that it carried weight. In another kind of story, there would have been panic, a raised voice, an attempt to reclaim control through noise. Here, none of that applied. The rules governing this house were not social. They were older, colder, and far less forgiving. Evelyn rose from the water with deliberate slowness, not in shame or shock, but with the controlled readiness of someone who understood that sudden movement invited consequences. Water streamed from her skin, catching the dim light and breaking it into fragments. She did not cover herself. She assessed. What she saw in his face was not desire. It was calculation, precise and immediate. His gaze moved over her the way a scanner passed over an anomaly, mapping proportions, temperature, reaction time. He was not confirming what she was. He was measuring what kind of problem she represented. Beneath that clinical focus lay something else, something older than the identity he wore so convincingly. It flickered once, sharp and predatory, then vanished as he reasserted control. For a fraction of a second, the illusion failed. His outline warped, stretching against the edges of the room as if the space itself rejected his full shape. The air tasted metallic. Then he forced himself smaller, denser, human. The house relaxed by degrees. He left as he had arrived, without a word, without a sound, leaving behind a residue of cold that clung to the stone and to Evelyn's skin long after the door had closed. The water settled. The moment did not. By morning, the house had adjusted. Evelyn noticed the changes immediately. She always did. The number of security personnel had increased, not dramatically, but enough to shift patterns. Where there had been one guard at the East Hall, there were now two, positioned to maintain overlapping lines of sight. Doors that had previously yielded to her access card hesitated before unlocking, their mechanisms engaging in a different sequence. Her clearance had not been revoked, but it had been narrowed, subtle limitations imposed without explanation. The house had decided to watch her more closely. She moved through her assigned tasks with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed since arrival, but her attention split itself between surface and depth. Every glance from staff lingered a fraction longer. Every interaction carried a faint pressure beneath politeness. She understood the process. She was being evaluated from multiple angles, by people trained to notice inconsistencies, and by others trained to notice things that did not register on paper at all. The confirmation came in the laundry room. It was a small thing, almost nothing. A cheap metal pendant dulled with wear, caught in the lip of an industrial washer. The chain was broken, one link twisted open as if pulled too hard. Evelyn recognized it instantly. Her sister had worn it for years, an impulse purchase from a street vendor, worthless except for familiarity. No one would have kept it as a trophy. No one would have cataloged it. It was the kind of object that survived only by accident or neglect. Her pulse steadied rather than spiked. Fear sharpened her focus instead of scattering it. The house had not swallowed her sister whole. It had kept traces. Cal's attention never announced itself directly. He did not summon her. He did not confront her. Instead, his presence manifested through intermediaries. The estate manager asked questions framed as routine verification. A driver commented on her accent and waited too long for a response. A physician affiliated with the foundation examined her hands under the pretense of a minor injury, his gaze lingering on the lines of her palms, the color beneath her nails. Each encounter probed a different vector. Together, they formed a net. She noticed what they shared. None of them met their own reflection if they could avoid it. Mirrors were passed quickly, eyes sliding away. Windows remained shuttered even when the weather invited them open. Fresh air, unfiltered, seemed unwelcome. Evelyn filed the detail away. As days passed, the architecture of the house revealed itself more clearly. The protective measures were not ornamental. The salt embedded along thresholds was renewed daily, swept into patterns that appeared careless but were meticulously maintained. Silver threads stitched into the hems of curtains caught light at specific angles, disrupting it subtly. Carved symbols in wood paneling repeated at intervals too consistent to be coincidence. This was not superstition. It was infrastructure. The house was not defending against intrusion. It was containing something already inside. Cal Harrow began to appear closer to her orbit, not by choice but by necessity. He occupied adjacent spaces, timed his movements to intersect hers without forcing interaction. Each proximity strained his control. Evelyn observed the signs with clinical detachment. His facial muscles betrayed micro-failures when he held expressions too long. His tolerance for daylight diminished. During morning hours, his presence thinned, as if light abraded something beneath his skin. After he passed, the air carried the sharp, electric scent of ozone, brief but unmistakable. He watched her with the attention of a hunter forced into stillness, alert to the danger of miscalculation. She was no longer simply a potential threat. She was a variable that disrupted patterns he had relied on for years. What unsettled him most was not what she might do, but what she had already seen. That night replayed itself in fragments he did not fully own. The water, the stillness, the moment when he had recognized her before he understood why. The sensation of something aligning and misaligning simultaneously. These were not memories from his human life. They rose from deeper strata, from agreements and transformations sealed long before he wore this name. Evelyn sensed the shift as well, though she framed it differently. She recognized the way predators adjusted when prey refused to behave correctly. She refused to flinch, refused to rush. Her movements remained measured, her routines unbroken. She let them watch her because she wanted them to underestimate her compliance. At night, when the house settled into its artificial quiet, she mapped corridors in her mind. She counted seconds between patrol passes. She traced the limits of her access and noted where resistance increased. The building responded to her presence like a body aware of foreign matter, but uncertain how aggressively to respond. Cal stood at the center of that response, constrained by rules he had not written but could not violate without consequence. The house required balance. The agreements required witnesses and boundaries. Evelyn had become both. He did not approach her out of curiosity or desire. He approached because something within the structure of his existence demanded resolution. The longer she remained, the more pressure built along fault lines he had sealed decades earlier. Her presence pulled at memories that were not supposed to surface, at obligations deferred but not erased. She, in turn, understood that she had crossed from observer to participant. The pendant in the laundry room had anchored her resolve, but it also confirmed the scale of what she faced. This was not a simple disappearance. This was a system that consumed people selectively, according to logic that had nothing to do with justice. By the end of the second night, both of them knew the same truth, though neither named it. Evelyn was a witness who could not be erased quietly. Cal was a hunter bound by rules that made her untouchable and therefore dangerous. The house held them in enforced proximity, its wards humming softly, its foundations remembering older nights. Above them, the city continued its uneven breathing, unaware of the recalibration taking place behind iron gates and polished doors. Within the walls, something ancient shifted its weight, alert now, and waiting to see which of them would break first. The symbol appeared in the ledger first, not on her skin. Evelyn found it while the house still pretended it was morning. Sunlight seeped through the garden district like diluted whiskey, pale and unreliable, and the mansion carried that controlled quiet that always felt staged. She had been assigned a simple errand, a harmless task meant to keep her moving in approved circles. Instead, she followed a corridor that was not on her route, slipped past a door that should have been locked, and entered a room that smelled like paper, lemon oil, and something faintly metallic beneath both. The foundation kept its records in a private office behind the public facade of philanthropy. A glass-fronted cabinet held framed photographs of galas and ribbon cuttings. A carved credenza displayed plaques and commendations. But the real history lived in drawers, binders, and spreadsheets printed and filed as if ink could hold down what memory refused to. Evelyn did not flip pages quickly. She had learned that speed was a confession. She moved like someone doing routine clerical work, careful not to leave a disturbance. She checked the sign-in sheets first, then donor registries, then staff lists. Names blurred together in the same clean fonts, the same formatted columns, the same relentless confidence that order could be manufactured. Then she saw her sister's name. It sat there as if it belonged, nestled between a regional sponsor and a guest of honor, dated 6 months earlier. The entry was clean and complete. Full name, brief notation of invitation category, a simple status marker. It would have been almost comforting if it had not been for the mark beside it, a symbol no respectable institution would ever use. It looked like a crown turned upside down, with a narrow notch cut into its center like an old scar. Not ornate, not decorative, more like a brand. It did not align with any other column. It did not match any key. It simply sat there, quiet and wrong, as if the ledger had briefly forgotten it was being watched. For a moment, Evelyn's body did not react. Her mind counted facts first, because facts were safer than grief. The symbol appeared only twice on the page. One instance was her sister. The other was a name she did not recognize, with a date 2 years earlier. Both had the same status: withdrawn, voluntary, resolved. The word voluntary made her stomach tighten. It was too neat, too smooth. It was the kind of word used when someone wanted a story to end without questions. She copied the line into her phone by hand rather than taking a photo. Cameras were greedy and careless. Handwriting made her slow enough to remember every detail. She set the ledger back exactly as she found it, smoothed the page as if it had never been touched, and left the room without turning her head. Outside the mansion, New Orleans waited like a city that always knew more than it said. Evelyn went into the French Quarter late that afternoon, when tourists still made noise and the streets pretended to be harmless. She walked under wrought iron balconies streaked with water stains and moss, past voodoo shops selling sanitized versions of fear, past bars that opened early because the city's relationship with daylight had never been honest. The air carried river damp and exhaust, sweet rot and frying oil, the perfume of a place that lived on contrasts and survived on secrets. She did not head to the police. She did not head to a news station. She knew how stories died here. They were either laughed at or monetized until they became unrecognizable. Instead, she went to the kind of person the city hid in plain sight, someone who handled paperwork for those who could not afford to be visible. A clerk in a rented office above a closed-down music store pulled public filings and charity event rosters, the official copies that matched the foundation's private ledger. Evelyn paid in cash and asked for nothing that sounded like accusation. The rosters confirmed her sister's invitation and the withdrawal. No symbol appeared in public documents. The public story had been polished clean. She walked out into the humid dusk with the paper folded inside her bag like a weapon. If the symbol existed only in private, then it belonged to a private logic. The foundation had 2 languages, one for daylight and one for whatever lived behind the gates. Night arrived quickly. In New Orleans, darkness did not descend. It rose, thick and warm, as if the ground exhaled it. Streetlights lit puddles and cigarette smoke. The city began to hum with a different kind of activity, the kind that did not advertise itself but multiplied anyway. Evelyn moved through it with her collar turned up and her attention split between reflections and exits. The sensation from the basement returned whenever she passed a window. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of being measured. She could not prove anyone followed her. She also could not shake the feeling that the city itself had eyes when it wanted them. When she returned to the mansion, the gate opened without hesitation, but the silence on the grounds felt thicker than before. The trees stood too still. The air smelled faintly of rain that had not fallen. She crossed the gravel drive and noticed fresh white powder at the base of the doorframe, newly laid, the line unbroken. Someone had strengthened the boundary while she was gone. Inside, staff moved with controlled normalcy, but their bodies gave away tension. They avoided certain corridors. They did not linger under chandeliers. They glanced down at thresholds, as if counting steps. Evelyn did her tasks, answered questions with short, neutral truths, and kept her hands steady. She had learned that steadiness unsettled people more than anger. After midnight, she went looking again. She did not rush. She waited for the rhythm of patrols, for the soft footfalls that marked the guards' circuits. She listened to the way doors clicked shut in sequence. The mansion had a pulse, and once she learned it, she could move between beats. She found the first hidden place by smell. A door at the end of a service corridor was labeled storage. The plaque was clean, the paint fresh, the edges too sharp. Evelyn pressed her palm against it and felt a faint vibration on the other side, almost like machinery. When she leaned closer, she caught the scent of incense, sweet and heavy, layered over something coppery that made her mouth go dry. No storage room smelled like prayer and blood. The lock yielded to her access card on the second attempt, as if the system hesitated and then decided not to admit it had hesitated. The room beyond was dim and narrow. Shelves held boxes of linens and supplies arranged in perfect rows, almost theatrical in their neatness. But the floor near the far wall had been cleaned too thoroughly, the kind of clean that tries to erase. It carried a faint stain in the stone, a darker patch that did not align with any spill pattern. The air in the room felt cooler, heavier, as if the walls were thicker than they should have been. Evelyn did not touch anything she did not need to. She stood in the threshold and let her eyes adjust. On the back wall, behind stacked boxes, she noticed a thin vertical seam that could have been a crack. It was too straight. It ran from floor to ceiling with the precision of a concealed door. She left before curiosity could become evidence. The second hidden place revealed itself through texture rather than scent. A corridor on the lower level looked ordinary at first glance, wallpaper patterned in muted florals, framed photographs of the property in different decades. But when Evelyn brushed her fingers lightly along the wall as she passed, she felt the thickness. Layers. Paint laid over something that had been gouged and then covered. The surface was too smooth, too carefully repaired. It was a corridor that had survived violence and then been taught to lie about it. The third was the most unsettling, because it did not need to hide. A safe sat behind a panel in a study that visitors never saw. It was large enough to hold documents, small objects, maybe a handgun. The panel was not reinforced. There were no cameras aimed at it. The protection was not technological. It was behavioral. The space around it felt like a hush, as if the air itself discouraged approach. Evelyn sensed it the way she sensed a cliff edge in fog. No sign, but the body understood the drop. She backed away, heart steady, mind racing. Her sister's disappearance had been a wound she could name. This was something else. It was architecture built around an absence, ritual disguised as routine, an entire house engineered to keep a particular kind of truth from leaking into daylight. Evelyn felt the internal conflict sharpening like a blade. She had come for her sister. She was now standing at the edge of a story that looked larger than one missing person, larger than one foundation, larger than one man. She returned to her room before dawn, careful not to be seen. She washed her hands twice, not because they were dirty, but because her skin remembered copper and incense and the thick hush around the safe. She lay in bed with the light off, listening to the mansion settle, and tried to make her mind stop building connections. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and tense. When she woke, it was still dark. Her body felt hot, as if she had been running. She sat up and realized her wrist itched. On the inside of her left wrist, just below the pulse point, a faint line marked her skin. At first it looked like an impression from fabric, a temporary crease. Then her eyes focused and the shape clarified. It was the same symbol from the ledger. An inverted crown with a notch like a scar, drawn not in ink, but in the subtle discoloration of something under the skin. It was not raised. It was not irritated. It looked as if it had always been there and simply decided to show itself now. Evelyn stared until her eyes watered. She pressed her thumb against it hard enough to blanch the skin. The mark did not fade. She ran to the bathroom and scrubbed it with soap, then with a rough towel, then with alcohol from a small first aid kit she carried. Her skin reddened, but the symbol remained, calm and precise, as if it belonged to her more than her own pulse did. She tried to breathe slowly. She tried to think like a rational person. Allergic reaction, bruising, some chemical transfer from work supplies, but the symbol was too clean. It matched too perfectly. It was not random. It was an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. The house felt different with that mark on her skin. Corridors seemed narrower. Thresholds felt heavier. Mirrors reflected her too sharply, the edges of her figure almost outlined, as if the glass recognized something new. She kept her wrist covered, not out of shame, but out of instinct. Marks were meant to be seen by someone. She did not yet know who. Later that morning, she crossed paths with Cal Harrow in a hallway where sunlight cut through a high window in a pale blade. The light should have softened him. Instead, it made his face look more carved, his eyes darker by contrast. He did not greet her. He did not pause, but his gaze flicked down, precise as a scalpel, to the place where her sleeve covered her wrist. His entire body changed in the space of a heartbeat. The control remained, but it tightened, the way a man's grip tightened on a steering wheel when he saw an accident unfolding ahead. His jaw set. A muscle jumped once near his cheekbone. The air around him sharpened, ozone thin and immediate. Evelyn felt it on her tongue, metallic and cold. He looked at her, then, as if he no longer had the luxury of pretending she was incidental. For the first time, she understood that his restraint was not politeness. It was containment. It was effort. There was fear in the way he held himself, but it was not fear of her. It was fear of what proximity might trigger, of what he might become in the space between intention and instinct. Later, a small medical box appeared in the supply area assigned to her, placed neatly as if it belonged. Sterile gauze, antiseptic, gloves, a clinical thermometer, a vial of something labeled only with a number. No note, no explanation. The gesture was almost ordinary. That was what made it terrifying. Ordinary gestures did not exist in this house without purpose. Evelyn carried the box to her room and set it on the desk. She stared at it for a long time without opening it. She did not want to accept care from something that might also be a claim. But refusing it felt like stepping outside the thin strip of safety she still had. She opened it with deliberate slowness. Everything inside was high quality, expensive, curated. The vial had a tamper seal. The gloves were latex-free. This was not random kindness. It was preparation. Her mind ran through possibilities, refusing to settle. The mark might be a threat. It might be a target. It might be an invitation. All of those implied the same thing. Someone, somewhere, had decided her body belonged inside a system she had not consented to. That afternoon, she used the Foundation's public computer terminals under the pretense of scheduling errands. She searched local court records, the kind of mundane digging that could be justified if questioned. Fires, foundations, property disputes, insurance settlements. She expected nothing immediate. She expected hours of noise before signal. The signal came anyway. A civil case filed 20 years earlier sealed portions noted in the docket. A warehouse fire outside Baton Rouge officially ruled accidental. Several plaintiffs, one prominent defendant, Harrow Holdings. The names struck like a dropped weight. Evelyn opened what she could access and scanned the archived attachments. A photograph appeared in the file, grainy, printed and later digitized, showing a woman standing near a burned-out structure with investigators in the background. The woman's face was turned slightly away, but enough of it was visible to make Evelyn's chest tighten. The bone structure, the line of the mouth, the gaze caught by the camera at an angle that felt familiar in the most intimate way. It was not a perfect match. It was worse than that. It was the kind of resemblance that made coincidence feel like an insult. Evelyn stared until the screen blurred. She looked at her own reflection in the darkened glass beside the monitor, the angle of her cheek, the shape of her eyes. The similarities aligned too easily, like a key finding its lock. She closed the file and cleared the search history, hands steady despite the tremor under her skin. By nightfall, she understood only this. Her sister's name in the ledger was not the beginning of the story. The symbol had existed before her sister ever entered the Foundation's world. The mark on Evelyn's wrist meant the story had found her now, directly, with no buffer left. And Cal Harrow was not simply watching her because she was a suspicious employee. He was watching her because something in him recognized the symbol as a binding. The mansion felt quieter that night, but the quiet carried weight, as if the house listened. The warded thresholds held their lines of salt. The mirrors stayed angled. The windows remained closed. The air tasted faintly of storm. Evelyn lay awake with her sleeve pulled down over her wrist, feeling the pulse beneath the mark like a heartbeat trapped under glass. She did not know what the symbol demanded. She only knew it had chosen flesh over paper, and once a thing like that left the ledger and entered the body, it did not do so without intent. Outside, New Orleans kept spilling music and noise into the streets, as if sound could drown out fate. Inside the iron gates, a witness and a hunter moved under the same roof, both aware now that the contract had shifted from rumor to skin. The restricted archive did not announce itself as forbidden. It sat beneath the Foundation's public records like a shadow aligned too precisely to be accidental, a digital annex layered under layers of access permissions and behavioral deterrence. Evelyn reached it not through brute force or stolen credentials, but through patience. She watched how systems behaved when they believed they were alone. She learned which terminals refreshed their permissions at odd hours, which internal accounts were trusted because they had always been trusted, and which doors opened when no one expected them to. The archive revealed itself late at night, when the mansion's internal networks slowed into maintenance cycles, and the guards' attention drifted toward routine rather than anomaly. Evelyn accessed it from a workstation meant for scheduling donations and reviewing grant proposals. The transition from sanctioned files to hidden ones did not trigger alarms. It felt less like breaking in and more like stepping through a door left deliberately unlocked. What she found was not charity. The documents were cleanly labeled, meticulously organized, and utterly indifferent to morality. Contracts referenced shipping routes, private airstrips, warehouses leased through shell corporations, and secure residences across several states. Addresses repeated in patterns that aligned with missing persons reports Evelyn had already reviewed. Names appeared and disappeared between files, sometimes annotated with dates, sometimes with symbols, sometimes with nothing at all. The inverted crown appeared often here. It marked individuals selected for something beyond logistics. Next to some names were notes indicating verification completed, compatibility confirmed, transfer executed. Others were flagged as provisional, contingent, deferred. The language was transactional, stripped of sentiment, written by people who understood human lives as variables in a system that predated modern law. Evelyn saw the structure clearly now. People were not simply taken. They were filtered, assessed, integrated, sometimes returned, altered enough to serve as proof of loyalty or silence, sometimes retained as leverage, sometimes lost, their absence absorbed into the background noise of a city that knew how to forget. Her sister's name appeared again, deeper in the archive, paired with annotations that made Evelyn's hands go cold. The symbol marked her as a substitution, a corrective measure applied when a previous sequence had failed. The file did not explain the failure. It did not need to. The implication was enough. Someone else had been meant to stand where her sister had stood. Someone whose blood had not aligned correctly. Someone whose presence had broken the continuity the system required. Evelyn closed the file slowly, breathing through the pressure building behind her eyes. She understood now that her sister had not been chosen randomly. She had been used to stabilize something that had gone wrong. While Evelyn uncovered the architecture of the system, Cal Harrow confronted the fracture within himself. He had maintained the illusion of humanity through discipline and repetition for so long that it had become instinct. He dressed, spoke, and moved like a man because the world demanded it, and because the alternative carried consequences he could no longer afford. But the mark on Evelyn's skin had disrupted a balance he had spent decades preserving. He had not always been human. He had become human through an agreement that required constant renewal. Every philanthropic initiative, every closed-door negotiation, every favor extended into political and corporate spaces served the same purpose: containment. The house was not a luxury. It was a ward. His staff were not employees. They were custodians of a covenant that tethered him to flesh and time. The circle around him existed to ensure compliance. They watched him as closely as they watched the system, alert to deviations, prepared to intervene if he faltered. They believed they protected the world from what he was. He knew the truth was more complicated. They protected the agreement, not the outcome. That agreement demanded a bond sealed through blood, not romance. Marriage was the closest modern analog to a ritual that once required names etched into bone and lives bound until one of them broke. The bloodline mattered. The symbol mattered. The mark on Evelyn's wrist was not an invitation. It was an assertion of correction. Someone had made a mistake years ago, substituting the wrong woman during a transfer meant to anchor the covenant. That error had rippled forward, destabilizing the system in subtle ways that accumulated over time. The mark had gone dormant, waiting. Now it had awakened, choosing flesh that matched the original parameters. Cal recognized the inevitability with a clarity that felt like grief. The breaking point came not in the house, but on the street. Evelyn left the mansion in the early evening under the pretense of errands, her movements logged and approved. She did not notice the shift at first. The call came through on a borrowed phone, the number masked, the voice filtered. It carried the cadence of urgency and relief, claiming a sighting, a hospital intake, a chance. It referenced details only someone with access to Foundation files would know. Evelyn felt the trap before she saw it. She changed direction without accelerating, slipping into a crowded side street, then into a bar that smelled of spilled beer and old wood. She did not answer the phone again. She exited through the back and crossed into an alley that funneled sound and light away from her. The city narrowed, compressing into brick and shadow. That was when the second vector moved. A vehicle idled where no vehicle should idle, engine too quiet, windows too dark. A man stepped into her path with the practiced neutrality of someone who expected cooperation. Evelyn did not hesitate. She pivoted, bolted, and felt hands brush her sleeve as she tore free. The intervention came from behind. One of Cal's people, moving faster than human reflex should allow, redirected the man's momentum with minimal force. The encounter collapsed into seconds of confusion and retreat. No one raised a voice. No one chased. The street returned to itself as if nothing had happened. Evelyn did not look back. She walked until her legs steadied, until her breathing slowed, until the city's noise resumed its usual rhythm. She understood then that she had been tested, not eliminated, evaluated. Back at the mansion, the gates closed behind her with unusual haste. The house felt alert, its wards humming faintly, its staff quieter than usual. Cal did not approach her immediately. When he did, it was not in a public space. The truth emerged not through confession, but through necessity. He laid out the framework with controlled restraint, revealing just enough to prevent miscalculation. The covenant had been forged in an era that understood binding differently. Two women had been involved in the original ritual, their identities conflated through intent or error. The wrong woman had been marked, the wrong blood integrated. The system compensated by selecting replacements, adjusting parameters over generations, attempting to restore balance through substitution. In the modern world, this manifested as falsified documents, misfiled identities, marriages that never occurred but were recorded as completed. Bureaucracy had replaced ceremony. Contracts had replaced oaths. The result was the same: lives diverted into roles they had not chosen. Evelyn absorbed the implications without flinching. She saw the through line immediately. Her sister had been drawn into the system to stabilize a failure that did not belong to her. Now that Evelyn had been marked, the system no longer needed the substitute. Her sister had become leverage, a pressure point designed to ensure compliance. The realization burned cleanly, without hysteria. She could not walk away. She could not expose the foundation without triggering consequences that would bury her sister deeper or erase her entirely. Law enforcement would see only shell corporations and non-disclosure agreements. Media would see only conspiracy. The system was designed to survive scrutiny. The only remaining options required proximity. Evelyn evaluated them with the same cold precision the system used on its subjects. She could attempt to dismantle it from within, learning its mechanics well enough to introduce failure deliberately. Or she could enter it on her own terms, accept the role the mark demanded long enough to extract her sister and sever the leverage. Neither option offered safety. Both required sacrifice. Cal understood her calculation before she finished making it. He did not offer protection as a gesture of affection. He framed it as risk management, as containment. His fear was not of her defiance, but of what the covenant would demand if she resisted too openly. The agreement punished deviation brutally. It preferred compliance bought with pain over chaos unleashed by refusal. The mansion responded to the shift, as if sensing alignment. Security protocols tightened. Certain rooms became inaccessible, others opened. The safe Evelyn had sensed earlier no longer resisted her presence. The hush around it receded, replaced by something like acknowledgement. The house recognized her as relevant now. By the end of the night, the dynamic had changed irreversibly. Evelyn was no longer an infiltrator. She was a variable the system actively accounted for. The mark on her wrist pulsed faintly beneath her skin, synchronized with something deeper than her heartbeat. Her sister's fate hung in that rhythm, tethered to decisions Evelyn had not yet made but could no longer avoid. The agreement had not been signed in blood yet, but it had been outlined clearly enough to understand the cost. In a world governed by contracts older than justice, Evelyn stood at the threshold between refusal and participation, knowing that either choice would stain her hands. The system waited, patient and exacting, confident that it had finally corrected its error. The house changed its posture before anyone announced the gathering. Its corridors tightened, angles subtly corrected, light redistributed with surgical intent. Doors that had once yielded easily now required pauses, acknowledgments, a faint sense of permission. The mansion ceased to behave like a residence and began to operate like an institution. Not a sanctuary, not a fortress, but a court assembled for judgment. Evelyn felt the shift in her body before she understood it intellectually. The air pressed differently against her skin, denser around thresholds, thinner in open spaces. The mark on her wrist warmed beneath the fabric of her sleeve, not painfully, but insistently, like a reminder tapping from the inside. She had crossed an invisible line, and the house responded by clarifying its rules. Those rules did not belong to Cal alone. The people around him gathered with quiet efficiency, arriving in pairs or alone, never all at once. They did not announce themselves, and they did not greet one another with familiarity. Each of them carried the same careful restraint, the same practiced neutrality that came from knowing exactly how much could be revealed without consequence. They were not donors tonight. They were not patrons of culture or progress. They were custodians of continuity. Evelyn recognized the pattern quickly. These were individuals who lived between categories, financiers who never appeared on public boards, legal experts whose names vanished from filings after landmark cases, religious figures whose influence did not require pulpits. They were the ones who ensured the city's night did not bleed too far into its day. They benefited from the system not because they controlled it, but because they survived within its boundaries. Their fear was not abstract, it was practical. They understood that if the demonological structure collapsed, it would not do so cleanly. Reality would not simply reset. The agreements embedded into the city's foundations would unravel unevenly, tearing at the seams between what humans perceived and what actually governed the dark hours. Those who had adapted to the rules of night would be exposed. Those who depended on its protections would lose them. Chaos would not arrive as fire and screaming, but as erosion, misalignment, events that no longer obeyed causality. Cal stood at the center of that fear. Evelyn saw it clearly now. He was not merely protecting his own existence. He was holding pressure on a system that wanted to rupture. The house was not his indulgence, it was his burden. Every corridor, every ward, every ritualized routine existed because his continued stability required it. He was the lid on a boiling structure, and the people around him understood that removing him would not cool it. It would release it. That understanding did not make them merciful. Cal's attempt to shield Evelyn took the form of control, because control was the only language the system respected. Her movements were restricted. Her access narrowed. Surveillance tightened around her without apology. He framed it as protection, but she felt the bars immediately. The golden quality of the cage did nothing to soften its reality. Evelyn resisted instinctively. She had never endured confinement well, especially not when disguised as care. She tested boundaries, altered routines, lingered where she was not expected to linger. Each small act of independence sent ripples through the house. Staff noticed. The circle noticed. The mark on her wrist responded with a low, rhythmic heat that matched the tension in the air. Her refusal to comply fully did not go unnoticed. It accelerated what might otherwise have unfolded slowly. The gathering took place in a room that had never been used for celebration. It lay beneath the main floors, accessible through a stairwell that descended too far for comfort. The walls were stone, old and unadorned, bearing marks that had never been erased because erasure would have required acknowledgement. Light came from recessed fixtures that cast no shadows, leaving faces fully exposed. Evelyn was brought there not as an accused, but as evidence. The people assembled did not look at her immediately. Their attention focused on Cal, measuring him, weighing his control, assessing the risk he represented now that the marked woman stood within their jurisdiction. The system had always allowed for variables, but only when those variables behaved predictably. Evelyn did not. Her designation came without ceremony. She was identified as a breach, a deviation from established protocol. The language used stripped her of personhood efficiently. She was not a woman acting out of desperation. She was a carrier of a seal who refused to accept its constraints. In their logic, that refusal alone constituted a threat. Free will was not romanticized here. It was treated as friction, and friction damaged mechanisms. Evelyn felt the judgment settle over her like a weight. She did not bow under it. She stood still, breathing evenly, aware that reaction would be catalogued as weakness or instability. Her anger remained contained, focused, a tool rather than a liability. Cal moved before the verdict could finalize. He did not argue her innocence. He did not appeal to sentiment or morality. Those currencies held no value in this space. Instead, he claimed responsibility in the only way the system recognized. He identified himself as the point of failure. He framed her presence not as rebellion, but as consequence. If the mark had awakened prematurely or improperly, it was because the structure governing it had been mismanaged under his stewardship. The room recalibrated. Responsibility shifted. Attention narrowed. The people who had prepared to neutralize Evelyn redirected their scrutiny to Cal. This was not the outcome they preferred, but it was one they could accept. The system favored self-correction over external disruption. The punishment was not theatrical. No blood was spilled on the stone floor. No dramatic display satisfied voyeuristic instincts. Instead, the penalty was precise, invasive, and deeply personal. Cal was required to relinquish control over specific aspects of his binding, to loosen restraints that kept his non-human nature in check. The process weakened the interface between his human form and what lay beneath it, creating vulnerability where there had once been discipline. Evelyn felt the shift as a pressure drop, like a sudden change in altitude. The air vibrated faintly. The wards embedded in the walls flared once, then settled into a new configuration. Cal's posture altered almost imperceptibly, his balance adjusting to compensate for a loss that would never be visible to an untrained eye. This was not pain meant to instruct through suffering. It was damage meant to enforce compliance. By sacrificing a portion of his stability, Cal reaffirmed the system's primacy. He accepted that his role was not to negotiate with the rules, but to embody them. The cost was immediate. His presence grew heavier, less contained. The subtle distortions Evelyn had noticed before sharpened at the edges. The ozone scent intensified, lingering longer after his movements. Light reacted differently around him, bending rather than reflecting cleanly. He remained composed, but the effort required to maintain that composure had increased exponentially. Evelyn watched with a clarity that surprised her. She had expected anger, perhaps even satisfaction at the system turning on one of its own. What she felt instead was recognition. Not tenderness, not affection, but an understanding of the weight he carried and the deliberate nature of his choice. This was not sacrifice born of emotion. It was loyalty to a structure that would collapse without him, and a calculated decision to place himself between that collapse and the woman it threatened to destroy. Underneath his cold restraint, she saw something far more unsettling than cruelty or desire. She saw fidelity, not to her as a person, but to the integrity of the outcome he believed necessary. It was a form of devotion that did not seek approval and did not soften itself for comfort. The assembly accepted the punishment and dispersed without ceremony. The House absorbed the shift with muted compliance, its systems rebalancing around the altered center of gravity. Evelyn was escorted out not as a prisoner, but not as a free agent either. Her status had changed, but not resolved. In the aftermath, silence filled the corridors like residue. Staff moved carefully, avoiding unnecessary interaction. The mansion no longer felt like a place that watched her. It felt like a place that accounted for her. Evelyn returned to her room with her thoughts sharpened rather than dulled. The events had stripped away any lingering illusion that this conflict could be navigated through half measures. The system would not tolerate ambiguity. It would either be obeyed, rewritten, or broken. She sat on the edge of the bed and uncovered her wrist. The mark had darkened slightly, its lines more defined, as if responding to the exchange that had just taken place. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a reminder that contracts did not require signatures when flesh was available. Somewhere else in the house, Cal recalibrated his control, sealing fractures, reinforcing boundaries with diminished resources. The cost of his choice would compound over time. Evelyn understood that as well. The punishment had not ended anything. It had only delayed escalation. For the first time since arriving in New Orleans, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation without retreating into analysis. Fear surfaced, sharp and immediate, followed closely by resolve. She would not allow the system to define her as an object or a correction. She would not allow her sister to remain leverage. The house had declared its rules. Cal had paid their price. What remained was to decide whether those rules would stand unchallenged. Rain had scrubbed the city without cleansing it. New Orleans after a storm looked like a place that had been rinsed and left to dry in its own contradictions. Water clung to balcony ironwork in fat beads, trembling whenever a streetcar passed. Puddles held broken reflections of neon and police light bars, turning every corner into a distorted mirror. The air felt heavier, not fresher, saturated with wet brick, river breath, and the sweet decay of garden flowers collapsing under humidity. The streets were the same streets. The quarter still glittered and lied, and yet something had shifted in the invisible mathematics of the night. Evelyn moved through the morning, as if the city had reclassified her. Nothing in the public world acknowledged it. Her phone still connected. Credit cards still worked. Tourists still laughed too loudly beneath dripping awnings. But inside the boundaries that mattered, she was no longer an employee who could be dismissed or ignored. She was a named condition, a marked element written into a system that preferred paperwork to prophecy. The inverted crown under her sleeve pulsed faintly with her heartbeat, warm as an insult. The symbol had traveled from ledger to flesh, and the moment it did, her freedom became negotiable. The night of judgment in the basement chamber left residue. It lingered in the mansion's corridors as a new kind of silence, one that did not come from absence, but from surveillance that no longer bothered to hide. Doorways felt like checkpoints. The air near thresholds carried the mineral bite of salt laid fresh and precise. Staff eyes slid away from her face and returned, unable to fully commit to either familiarity or contempt. The house had turned its attention into a beam, and Evelyn stood in the center of it. Cal Harrow carried his own residue, heavier and more dangerous. The punishment had not broken him openly. It had weakened the internal restraints that made him pass as merely human. The human shape still held, but it held like a tightly wrapped bandage over something that wanted to push through. The faint distortions around his outline sharpened when he moved too quickly. Light reacted strangely near him, fluttering as if it could not decide how to settle. The scent of ozone clung to him longer now, a clean, electrical threat that never fully dispersed. Evelyn understood the new reality with cold clarity. The system had placed her on a board and begun counting moves. If she wanted her life back, and if she wanted her sister back, she would have to reach an end point the system recognized as closure. That meant finishing the story on terms the story had never offered her. She began with the city, not with the house. Police databases were too blunt, too visible. Cameras were owned by institutions that had already decided what they would and would not see. Evelyn went instead to the people who survived by pretending they noticed nothing. New Orleans was built on those people, on their selective blindness, on their ability to hold secrets without believing in them. The first thread came from a night clinic that operated in a narrow slice of legality. It sat behind a laundromat and a closed-down vape shop, its entrance marked only by a small sign and a security camera aimed at the sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. The waiting room chairs were plastic and uncomfortable, designed to discourage lingering. Evelyn arrived late enough that the city outside had begun to glow again, wet pavement reflecting streetlights like oil. A nurse behind the desk looked at Evelyn's face and then at her hands, not with suspicion, but with recognition. Evelyn did not ask directly about her sister. She asked about intake patterns, about unnamed patients who arrived with paperwork too clean and injuries too specific, about people who came in during storms and left before morning without records. She offered details that proved she understood discretion. She did not threaten. She made herself credible. The nurse's expression stayed neutral, but the pulse in her throat gave away unease. She pointed Evelyn toward a pattern rather than a name, toward a sequence of night arrivals tied to a private transport service and a church-run outreach program that did not appear on any official roster. The nurse never claimed certainty. She did not need to. Evelyn recognized the shape of the truth even when it was offered as rumor. The second thread came from a bartender in the quarter who measured lives by what people tried to forget. His bar was narrow and dark, its ceiling stained by time and smoke. The floor was still damp from the rain, and every footstep made the wood complain. He had the face of someone who had seen too much and learned to let it pass through him. Evelyn sat at the far end, ordered something simple, and watched the room before she spoke. She asked about private events that did not appear on social calendars, about men in tailored suits who arrived with nothing but a glance and left with a slight change in the atmosphere. She asked about the nights when the city's usual noise dipped for no reason, when people felt compelled to go home early without understanding why. The bartender did not answer at first. He cleaned a glass slowly, his hands steady, his eyes unfocused as if listening to a different room. Then he mentioned an abandoned church on the edge of the city, a place the neighborhood avoided even in daylight. He did not call it haunted. He called it wrong. He spoke of vehicles arriving after rain, of people entering without flashlights and leaving with their shoulders set differently. He spoke of certain symbols painted over and over on the brick near the side entrance, always scrubbed off by morning, always returning. Evelyn's mark warmed under her sleeve, as if responding to the coordinates. The third thread came from a courthouse archive, in a building that smelled like old paper and humidity trapped in stone. A woman there, older than the files she guarded, moved with slow precision and spoke with the calm of someone who had witnessed too many tragedies to dramatize them. Evelyn requested records of a fire from 20 years earlier, the case tied to Harrow Holdings, the docket that contained a photograph too similar to ignore. She framed it as genealogical research, an attempt to clarify family history, an effort to resolve identity. The archivist studied Evelyn's face longer than politeness allowed, and in that prolonged gaze, there was a hint of something deeper than curiosity. She produced the file without comment. As Evelyn scanned the pages, she noticed small irregularities in the record. Missing attachments, references to sealed testimonies, a list of names that included a church property transfer finalized the week after the fire. The archivist pointed with one finger at a line item and then withdrew her hand as if she had touched something hot. The abandoned church was not just a location, it was an intersection. Evelyn left the courthouse with the rain-slick city stretching around her like a living, breathing trap. The threads converged into one destination, and the convergence felt too clean to be chance. The system did not simply allow her to find a path. It guided her toward a sanctioned endpoint. That meant the church was not only where her sister had been taken, it was where the contract expected its next phase to occur. She returned to the mansion and did not pretend she had not changed. The house recognized her momentum. Doors opened with less resistance, not because she had earned trust, but because the system preferred predictable movement toward resolution. Her access expanded in small ways that felt like permission disguised as convenience. In the supply closet, a new set of keys lay where they had not been before. In a hallway, a guard stepped aside without being asked. The house had recalibrated her status from nuisance to participant. Cal found her in a corridor lined with portraits of men who had never been fully human. Their faces stared out from gilt frames, eyes too steady, expressions too controlled. Evelyn stood beneath them, her posture straight, her breathing even. Cal's presence altered the air around him, and the portrait seemed to deepen in shadow as he approached, as if acknowledging one of their own. He did not stop her. He could not. If she moved alone, the system could take her cleanly, frame it as voluntary compliance or unfortunate necessity. If she moved with him, the system would have to negotiate through the only lever it respected: his continued containment. He was both threat and guarantee, and that made him useful. They left the mansion after midnight, when the city's wet streets gleamed and the humidity pressed against skin like a damp cloth. New Orleans smelled of storm runoff and jasmine struggling not to rot. The drive took them through neighborhoods that changed like moods: bright tourist corridors dissolving into quieter streets, then into industrial edges where the city's glamour peeled away and revealed its bones. Evelyn watched Cal from the passenger seat, without pretending not to. He no longer concealed his nature through small disciplines the way he had earlier. It showed in the way streetlights flickered as they passed, in the way metal guardrails seemed to emit a faint, sharper smell when he drew near, as if iron recognized him. The shadows inside the car did not fall normally. They gathered closer to him, obedient, as if he carried gravity that light could not fully counter. He held himself with rigid restraint, but the restraint was strained now, a constant negotiation between the human mask and the pressure beneath it. Evelyn understood that her proximity demanded his humanity, not as a moral choice, but as a requirement of the binding. If he let go completely near her, he would become the thing the house was built to contain, and she would become collateral. The abandoned church waited at the city's edge like a bruise. It stood behind a chain-link fence twisted and repaired too many times, its steeple broken, its stained glass boarded over. Vines crawled up its walls, feeding on damp brick. The street leading to it was narrow, and the puddles there reflected nothing but darkness. No neighborhood noise reached that place. Even the insects seemed quieter, as if the air itself held its breath. Evelyn stepped out of the car and felt her mark pulse harder. The ground near the church smelled faintly of salt and old smoke. Symbols, half scrubbed and repainted, marked the side entrance. The inverted crown appeared there too, distorted by water streaks, the notch like a wound that refused to heal. Inside, the church did not feel abandoned. It felt occupied by absence. The air was cool and stale, thick with dust, and a faint sweetness that reminded Evelyn of incense left too long in a closed room. Broken pews lay in uneven rows. A collapsed section of ceiling exposed beams darkened by years of moisture. Yet the central aisle was clear, swept clean recently enough to leave subtle lines in the dust. Someone had prepared this place. They moved deeper, footsteps soft on cracked tile. In the rear of the nave, a door led down into a basement that did not match the church's blueprint. The stairs were stone, too old, the walls carved with repeating symbols that made Evelyn's eyes ache if she stared too long. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, losing its decay and gaining a metallic edge, as if something electrical lived beneath the damp. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber with an altar that was not religious. Candles burned without smoke. Shallow bowls sat in a circle, their contents dark and reflective. The mark on Evelyn's wrist warmed until it felt almost alive. She understood without needing instruction that this was where signatures happened. Not with pens, not with witnesses in suits, but with blood and intent. The system responded to her arrival with a subtle tightening in the air, like a room recognizing the final piece of a mechanism. Evelyn found her sister in a side room behind a curtained partition. She was alive. That was the first fact, the one Evelyn held onto like a nail in a storm. Her sister sat on a narrow cot, wrists free but posture broken. Her skin looked too pale under the candlelight, her eyes too slow to focus. There were no visible injuries that screamed violence, and that made it worse. The damage was internal, carved by fear and time and the knowledge that no one would arrive to reclaim her. Evelyn approached carefully, not because she feared her sister, but because she feared what sudden contact might do to a mind held too long in containment. Her sister's gaze lifted, and recognition took a long moment to land. When it did not bring relief immediately. It brought shock, then something like shame, as if being found was another test she had not been prepared to pass. Evelyn felt rage rise, clean and quiet. This was what the system did. It did not always destroy bodies. It broke narratives. It made victims feel complicit. It transformed survival into debt. She helped her sister stand. The sister's weight leaned too heavily, her muscles unaccustomed to choice. Evelyn steadied her without softness, without panic, her movements controlled and efficient. She did not promise safety. She focused on extraction. That was when the chamber reacted. The candles flared once. The air tightened into a pressure that made Evelyn's ears ring. Footsteps approached from the deeper corridor, not rushed, not loud, confident in ownership. The custodians of the contract had arrived, or perhaps they had been there all along, waiting for the moment when Evelyn's hands touched the leverage. Cal moved forward, positioning himself between Evelyn and the approaching presence. The shadows obeyed him more openly now, gathering along the floor, thickening near his feet. The ozone scent sharpened. The lights did not flicker this time. They dimmed, as if giving him room. He held himself rigidly, but the restraint looked like a chain pulled taut. Evelyn understood the geometry instantly. Her sister behind her, Cal in front, the system closing like a mouth. If she fled without resolving the contract, the system would follow. If she stayed and submitted, her sister might be released, but at the cost of replacing one hostage with another. The old contract wanted that exchange. It wanted correction. Evelyn refused the binary. She stepped into the chamber with her sister supported against her side and her sleeve pulled back to expose the mark. She did not offer it as surrender. She offered it as proof of authority the system had unwillingly granted her. She had been marked not as an ornament, but as a key. That meant the contract needed her as much as it wanted her contained. She made the only choice that created a third path. She claimed participation without obedience. The act that followed was not a romantic vow and not a cleansing victory. It was negotiation under threat, an agreement forged in a space that recognized only leverage. Evelyn used the mark to open the contract's logic, to force it into the light of its own inconsistencies. The system had consumed lives to patch an error. It had treated people as interchangeable components. She introduced a new rule: no more substitutions, no more hostages used as repairs. The binding would hold through structure and accountability, not through borrowed blood. Cal anchored the demand. He offered what the system respected most: his continued containment and the stability he provided the city's night. He did not surrender his nature, but he redirected it, framing the new agreement as the only way to prevent rupture. The old custodians resisted, not emotionally, but procedurally, measuring consequences. They feared change because change threatened the fragile equilibrium that kept their lives intact. Evelyn did not promise them safety. She promised them continuity with terms. The new contract took shape like a scar forming over an old wound. It was not clean. It did not erase what had been done. It did not heal her sister's brokenness with a simple reversal. It established a different mechanism, a system that required consent where it had once required disappearance, a structure that punished those who attempted to use humans as currency. It was a contract of darker honesty, not gentler outcomes. When it sealed, the air in the chamber released slightly, as if a locked joint had been reset. The candles steadied. The pressure in Evelyn's ears faded. The mark on her wrist cooled from heat into a dull, permanent presence, like ink that had finally dried. They left the church before dawn. The city outside was wet and quiet, the sky low and gray, the air still dense with humidity. Evelyn supported her sister, whose steps were unsteady but real. Cal followed, his presence still heavy, his restraint still strained, but something in the way the shadows moved around him suggested a new alignment. The night did not love him, and the day did not claim him, but the space between had been rewritten enough to hold. New Orleans after rain looked unchanged to anyone who did not know where to look. Streetlights reflected in puddles. The river breathed. The quarter prepared for another day of performed magic. But beneath the city's breath, the night's infrastructure had shifted. Evelyn understood that she had not won happiness. She had chosen responsibility over fate, war over escape. Her sister was alive, but not untouched. The house still existed, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a mechanism that would demand vigilance. The new contract would not end conflict. It would concentrate it, force it into quieter, smarter forms. She stayed near Cal not as a surrendered bride, not as a captive correction, but as a partner in a brutal agreement that required constant enforcement. Their bond was not tender. It was functional, sharpened by necessity and shaped by mutual threat. It carried no promise of softness, only the promise that neither would allow the system to feed on strangers again. The city continued to breathe its wet, fragrant night. And under that breath, a new order lived, not bright, not gentle, but honest in the only way darkness could be. It acknowledged the cost, and it demanded accountability from those who once hid behind silence. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.